Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, man, I have a very, very special guest, man. This brother is a extremely dope researcher. He has a great YouTube channel that everybody should make sure that they're tapped into. We're about to go through some connections between ancient Egypt and West Africa, possibly. And so he has some great slides that we're about to get into, some great information. This brother Kamji and his YouTube channel is Kamjiverse. Thank you for coming through the show, brother.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you for having me and look forward to this intense conversation.
Absolutely. We've been planning this for a while, so I'm definitely glad that we are getting it done now. And for those who aren't familiar with the channel, tell them a little bit about the YouTube channel, how long you've been doing it, and what type of content you have.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually somebody who's been, watching, as they say in the bushes for quite a while.
Hmm.
Always been into this content. Especially classical Africa, ancient Kemet, having a family that comes from Western Cameroon, that's my parents, that's where my parents are from.
Hmm.
We will always talk about, just the Kemetic legacy of our people because it's
Mm.
very prominent within our oral narratives. So it was always something that I was interested in.
Hmm.
And just being in the space and like seeing, people in what we may call the conscious community or Africana research just be well in depth and discovering, our heritage in classical Africa really, really fascinated me.
Mm.
Right. And it was actually, Reggie Mabry from, Sonnetter TV,
Hmm.
who we did a conference together. Where actually it was Dr. Jahi Issa and Dr. Salim Faraji. They did a
Oh.
conference called Beyond West Africa.
Hmm.
And, I actually was kind of, shoehorned into a role of a translator because I'm fluent in French. And I didn't actually expect, to have that role, but I kind of came upon, the set and I knew, Dr. Salim Faraji and Dr. Issa beforehand. And there was a bunch of scholars from the African continent, some chematologists, archaeologists, and historians who didn't really speak English. So
Mm.
I served a role as basically translating their content into English and then translating some of the English scholars into French. And that's kind of how I met Reggie Mabry. I met Reggie Mabry, through that Beyond West Africa conference. And he was pushing me. He's like, "Hey, you should start a page," because
Hmm.
we would like build and chop it up, behind the scenes. And he was like, "You should start a YouTube page." And I was like, "Nah." I was kind
Yeah.
of like hesitant about
Yeah.
it. I was like, "Nah, I don't
Yeah.
know if I don't know about that." But what really kind of inspired me to go forward with it was just the amount of slander that was going
Mm.
against Africana scholars,
Hmm.
Black scholars, especially on the African continent. There's a lot of intricate research that a lot of brothers and sisters in the English speaking world don't have access to.
Hmm.
So I thought that it was wrong just to see them work so diligently and write so many books, like even more books than what you have behind you, right? And to
Hmm.
work so hard and just to be slandered and their work be demeaned. So I thought, it was best for, someone like myself who has the best of both worlds, coming from a African heritage background, being multilingual to kind of add my 2 cents.
Hmm.
And then the rest is history.
No doubt, man. And you're doing a great job. The people clearly love the channel. And so I definitely salute you for that work because our, our history is obviously extremely important to us. And not only our history, but the ones that came before us to teach us our history are extremely important to us and our lives. And it's a beautiful thing just to, play our part in continuing that narrative. And this whole idea that Afrocentric thought is less than or not academic is a narrative that it seems like this generation has to kill all over again because we have
Mm-hmm.
people in these spaces who are promoting this. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you're definitely one of those brothers that are doing a great job with teaching our history and explaining these narratives. And so we thank you again, brother.
Absolutely. And I have to say that on that point that you just made, a lot of this, no, all of this is political because
Absolutely.
Sheikh Anta Diop, his research wasn't that much different than, certain white scholars, what John Henry Clark called radical white scholars who came before him, like E.A. Wallace Budge,
Hmm.
etc. But the fact that he wanted to unite Africa against imperialism, that's what made most of the French conservatives, scared, and it
Right.
made them despise his work. And what I found is that many black people as well in the United States and, abroad, who oppose this research, specifically dealing with the historical documented connections between ancient Kemi and West Africa, are those who oppose Pan-African nationalism, and they oppose radical Black African politics. And they believe that if this is true, it undermines their objective of assimilating into the white society. So
Absolutely.
politics is everything in
Right.
this conversation.
Right. It's history is political, just like everything.
Yep.
Everything in American society is political. So to think
Mm-hmm.
history, education, and academia isn't, you're only fooling yourself. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And but I want to get into it, man, because this is you have some great information, and I want to. I just I'm ready to uh, get into this conversation and learn something, man. So
Mm-hmm.
um, first thing I wanted to ask you, when we're talking about possible connections between uh, West Africa and ancient Kemet, what linguistic evidence exists that directly connects West African languages with the ancient Egyptian language, considering the significant linguistic diversity within West Africa and between West Africa and Egypt?
Yeah, that's a very great question. And I think that most people who deal with this topic and who want to throw it in the garbage and call it pseudoscientific, they're mainly focused within these linguistic boundaries. You
Mm,
have Khoisan,
mhm,
you have Afro-Asiatic, you have Nilo-Saharan, and you have Niger Congo or Negro Congo. And the issue with these things is the fact that they were generated via what's called mass comparison or what's called multilateral comparative analysis. It's a super technical term,
mhm,
but this is by a scholar by the name of Joseph Greenberg. And Joseph Greenberg is a very famous linguist because he basically took the scholarship from the Hermeticist period, guys like Friedrich Mueller, guys like Karl Meinhof, who was a Nazi. Karl Meinhof is the inventor of Niger Congo or Negro Congo. Friedrich Mueller, he's a Hermeticist and he invented Afroasiatic. Then you have Gottlob Adolf Krauss, who invented Kwa. And you can go down the list. Most of the major language families, like Afroasiatic, was preliminarily called Hermeto-Semitic,
mm,
dealing with the Hermetic
mm.
myth,
Right.
the idea that white Caucasian, pastoralists were behind the civilizations of Africa. And many people, wrongly, they try to associate Hermeticism with Sheikh Anta Diop's work when he
Mm,
defeated Hermeticism. But going back to the language classifications, in modern historical linguistics, in historical comparative linguistics, they see Greenberg's, development of these different language families as pseudoscientific or invalid. And if you look at these languages, like Niger Congo, they will say that it's hypothetical. Like if you search it, you can search on Wikipedia right now, and it'll say that it's hypothetical.
mm,
Nilo-Saharan, they'll say that it's disputed. Khoisan, they'll say that it's completely debunked. It's completely defunct. It no longer exists. The so-called Khoisan language of South Africa is no longer there.
mm,
So historical linguists, because of the inadequacy of Joseph Greenberg's methodology of mass comparison, also called multilateral comparative analysis, and specifically the methodologies of glottochronology and lexicostatistics, which is basically a statistical coordination of different features of words or lexical items in the language to basically discern divergence points or when they split from a hypothetical ancestor.
mhm,
The reason that historical comparative linguists see this as invalid is because the rate of sound change in language is not constant. Language could change because of prestige. You have one ruler versus another ruler. Maybe you have a trade item that comes in, or aerial diffusion, borrowing may influence languages, like in the same way that Semitic influenced the ancient Kemetic language, or Metrem and Kemi, as it's described in Coptic. So you have a lot of different factors that can change language, invariably. That's not necessarily a consistent, constant rate as is prescribed by the method of glottochronology within mass comparison. So that's a little bit more technical,
Hmm.
But long story short, the boundaries that we see within the African world are not scientific boundaries. And you have scholars like Dr. Obadele Kambon, who is a chair of the Department of Linguistics in the University of Ghana. And he actually did some research on Theophilo Benga's work, analyzing different African languages. And what they found are over 100 putative cognates. And putative cognates are words that are potentially derived from the same ancestor in the same pre-dialectical family. And these putative cognates cut across these linguistic boundaries. So you'll find words in Mande languages that are close to Cushitic languages. You may find words in Yoruba that are closer to Kordofanian or closer to Chadic languages. And if these linguistic boundaries are true, if Afro-Asiatic is over here and Niger Congo is over here and Nilo-Saharan is over here and Khoisan is over here and they're different language families, you wouldn't have as many putative cognates. And the only way to describe this, to explain this away, and Dr. Obadele Kambon wrote about this, is if you can have some type of mechanism where these cognates spread from one source of origin or an Orheimat, which is a homeland in German, that's the use of term in linguistics. They spread from one origin and then they diffused all the way across the continent.
Hmm.
And the reason why that's unrealistic is that goes back to hyperdiffusionism, which is what characterized the Hamiticist theory, the theory that these languages or these civilizations and cultures spread from West Asian Caucasian pastoralists and just impose themselves on the entire continent.
Hmm.
Archaeologists see that as outdated.
Hmm.
So instead of the idea of these things diffusing into these separate language families, what Theophilo Benga and Cheikh Anta Diop posited is that they're actually part of the same language family that they called Paleo-African or Negro-Egyptian. And some people call it Black African, and there are others like there's a brother, a scholar, independent researcher. Me and him kind of beefed in the past. Asar Imhotep.
Hmm.
He's a gentlemanly guy, but we kind of disagreed on his linguistic methodology, and he's actually come up with his own versions and his own names and terminologies, which linguists are allowed to do.
Hmm.
But the bottom line is that these boundaries that we're using in Africa right now are not based upon the historical comparative method. And it's more likely that the majority of the languages in Africa, be they Chadic, Cushitic, be they West African languages, they're part of the Paleo-African or Negro-Egyptian language family.
Wow. And so when people give pushback to this idea, what is I know you said hyper diffusionism is a lot of times what they use to attempt to explain it, but from an overall broad sense, what do they use or say to try to discredit this idea of a Negro Egyptian language or Black African language?
Well, most people try to discredit it based upon the name. When you say Negro Egyptian, they say Negro is an anachronistic term. But the reason why that's kind of invalid is because, actually, not kind of, that's absolutely invalid, is because if you look at West African languages, they're originally called Negritic, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
Negritic
Hmm.
basically evolved into Negro or Niger Congo.
Hmm.
So you could certainly call Niger Congo Negro Congo if you wanted to. But also, if you look at the evidence, and this is some of the evidence compiled by Theophilo Benga, and he basically tackles the idea that the Kemetic language is Semitic. And he basically shows different paradigms of Semitic that don't match the ancient Egyptian language in his book, right?
Hmm.
And there's multiple paradigms, such as the biconsonantal paradigm, the monoconsonantal paradigm, or the paradigm of one consonant and two consonants, reduplication of the radicals, and a lot of different spaces within historical linguistics that prove that the ancient Egyptian language does not match Semitic. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Russell Shue, and Russell Shue actually, in his disagreement with Cheikh Anta Diop, he basically wanted to refute the idea that the ancient Kemetic language was related to Wolof. And what he did was he actually related it to Hausa
Hmm.
in the Lake Chad Basin, which is a so-called Chadic language. right?
Hmm.
So most scholars of what we may call Afro-Asiatic and, Africana scholars, historical linguists do not agree that Afro-Asiatic is a valid language phylum because of the fact that it was developed via mass comparison,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But most scholars of the Afro-Asiatic languages actually know that the ancient Kemetic language is closer to Chadic and closer
Mm.
to the Hausa language than it is to a language like, say, Somali,
Right,
right?
right,
So even in the paradigm of Afro-Asiatic, the Kemetic language is closer to the West African branch than it is to any of the other branches. And this is actually why there's a scholar by the name of Dr. Alain Anselin, and he posited that Afro-Asiatic should be renamed to Ethio-Chadic
mm.
because that's a more logical
Hmm.
explanation of what the family is and how it developed through time, right? So there's so many different points to get at, and
Right.
what I could do is like focus on the so-called Mande languages.
Okay.
And the Mande languages, most scholars who look at the Mande languages of West Africa, they say that the so-called Tichit culture was a proto-Mande culture.
Mm.
Now, there's a few problems with this theory, right? One of the main problems is that the archaeology makes it a little bit difficult to discern that Mande is associated with the ancient Tichit culture.
Hmm.
Most of the time, they're using what Dr. Kevin McDonald, an archaeologist, called linguistic speculation. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Dr. Vidrin. Vidrin is one of the main scholars who dealt with the idea of a proto Mande homeland. And from his analysis, the Mande languages came from the southern Sahara or the southern tip of the Sahara. And primarily, what he used to bolster this argument was the fact that after the desiccation of the Sahara, populations began migrating south. And those populations would begin to become what we now know as modern West Africans. The problem with that is the fact that most of the scholars who dealt with Mande without considering archaeological evidence, they posited that it came from, the lower West African zone, that it came from places like, the upper Volta region. Some people posited that it came from Benin. Other people posited that it may have come from, the southern Mali and everything. So there's different articulations that often conflict with each other
Hmm.
on this point, right? Another thing to note is that during the Holocene optimum, which is about 9,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, the Tichit or the Hod Depression that houses the ancient Tichit culture was filled with lakes, right?
Hmm.
So it would have been really difficult for a Proto Mande population to be developed in a place that was filled with water.
Hmm.
So when you strictly look at these African languages without comparative analysis with other regions of the continent, you end up with a lot of different problems.
Hmm.
And one of the major problems is the time depth.
Hmm.
Those of who are familiar with historical comparative linguistics knows that the time range of the comparative method is about 6 to 10,000 years. But if you were to coordinate Mande into Niger Congo, you're dealing with 12 or 14,000 years,
Right.
which is more along the lines of a long range comparison, which most historical linguists define as pseudoscientific.
Mm.
Now, there's a scholar by the name of Ducre,
Hmm.
and Ducre had an article published, in the Sheikh Anta Diop conference on Mande, on this Mande dilemma, and the fact that, people can't figure out what the Mande language is classified as, whether it's Niger Congo, whether it's related to Cushitic because of the different lexical series. But what he did is he looked at ocular expressions or expressions related to the eye. And he also looked at different, vocabulary items within the Mande language. And he actually found a putative genetic relationship or a certainly possible genetic relationship with the ancient Kemetic language,
Mm.
right? So the main point that I'm trying to get at is when you have an isolated approach of these African languages, because of the lack of documentation, because it's difficult to correlate, Greenberg's methodology with the archaeological evidence that we have at our disposal, and because of the numerous paradigms of relationships, that were established by Theophilo Benga, that measured African and West African and Central African languages with the Kemetic language, it's much more likely, with all of the evidence that we have at our disposal, that this Paleo African or Negro Egyptian language is true. There's much more evidence for that than Greenberg's mass comparison, which most historical linguists today are beginning to throw away.
Indeed, indeed. And so whenever we do begin to make these comparative analysis of cultures, obviously now in 2024, when we're studying people, um, we have genetics and something that the ones that came before us didn't have access to these different
Yeah,
genetic studies, right? And
yeah.
so, how do genetic studies on ancient Egyptians or ancient Egyptian mummies compare with genetic profiles of contemporary West African populations? And are there any significant genetic markers that suggest a direct lineage or a lineage at all?
Can you see my screen? Wait, this is the
Yes.
wrong one. Let me stop sharing. Let me stop sharing. I wanted to share the other one. This one. Okay, so this is a presentation that I did on Sonnetter's page.
Hmm.
I'm gonna try to make it a little bit bigger, and you can see this. You can see this this Abu Sir study.
Yes.
Okay, so this is the presentation. We did the genetic footprints of Kemet.
Okay.
And this is another big point that most people try to harp on. They say that there's no genetic evidence, just
Hmm.
like there's no linguistic evidence. So if we go down the list, when we're dealing with
And but
nominal
and
class,
before you go there, I don't mean to cut you off.
for sure.
I just saw on um Sod Netter the other day, uh brother Chief X was on there, and I guess Jabari was on there as well, and Chief X made the claim that and I don't know how well you can relate it to what these findings are, but he stated that when modern Egyptians have what are 68% genetically
Yeah.
the same as ancient Egyptians. So,
And then that's not the study that he's referring to is a study from the National Geographic Genographic Project, right?
mhm, mhm,
And this is a database that's now defunct because of ethical issues and
mhm,
certain racial issues, especially when it came to the definition of certain Native American populations and what they mean when they're talking about the the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic and the certain political terms that they were using. And long story short, they ran into a lot of ethical problems, and they had to basically completely rescind to completely rescind the database.
hmm.
So if you were to try to find that study online, you would not find it. It's
Wow.
not available.
Wow.
And what it actually said was the fact that modern Egyptians, according to that study, were 68% ancient North African. So they didn't actually state that they were ancient Egyptian or the ancient Kemetic population. They
Hmm.
were saying that they were North African, right? Now, the reason that that's completely false is because we have what's called an Arabization period.
Hmm.
So,
And so,
and
well, what is that idea though that there were no people because this is often said in conjunction with that there were no people like us in North Africa ever. You know what I'm saying? Like,
well, that's complete lie.
right.
And I think most scholars, you're talking about the standard Kevin McDonald, you're talking about Christopher Eyre, you're talking about Roger Blench. Most conventional archaeologists will not make the point that Chief X is trying to make,
Hmm.
because when you look at the so-called Iranian culture or the Ibero-Mauritian culture, if you're to use, like if we jump back to linguistics, if you're to use the standard Greenbergian linguistic model, and Theophile Obenga mentioned this in his book, Meaning of the Fight Against Eurocentric Africanists, when he was just opposing the European Eurocentric Africana scholars on the continent, is the fact that the standard logic is to want to correlate Niger Congo, Nilo Saharan, and Afro-Asiatic into one super macro family.
Mm.
That's the standard logic of historical linguistics. So the same logic is being applied when Theophile Obenga and Cheikh Anta Diop look at these African languages as independent nodes and try to relate them into the so-called Negro-Egyptian or Paleo-African language family. To
Mm.
the extent that many of these Greenbergian scholars, like Russell Shue, who opposed Cheikh Anta Diop, said that, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Congo, and Afro-Asiatic represent a supra-equatorial
Mm.
family. And that family was rooted in ancient North Africa, in the Iranian or Ibero-Mauritian culture,
Mm.
according to the conventional model.
Mhm.
Even if you looked at some of the paintings, some of the rock art in the Tassili culture of southern Algeria, you'll see people with braids,
Hmm.
you'll see people with afros,
Yep,
you'll
I've
see
seen
people
it.
with dark painted skin,
Hmm.
in opposition to some of the lighter skinned so-called Amazigh populations. So the idea that there was never any black people in North Africa is insane. It's crazy, and it's just a completely stupid point to make.
Right. All right, but yeah, if you can go ahead and build on some of the genetic links.
So before we get deep into it, we have to understand the most famous, study that people mention when they try to say that modern Egyptians are the same as the ancient Egyptians is the Abusir Malek study. And the Abusir Malek study represented one sepot in northern Kemet representing 2.4% of all sepots. And a sepot is an administrative district, also called a nome. So they took samples from 2.4% of the entire civilization, and they only retrieved like three bodies. So
Mm.
you're using three bodies of the northern Kemet of
To
2.4%.
represent everybody.
And again, in those three bodies, they know that they were foreigners.
Hmm.
Some of them had Greek names, some of them had Roman names, Hebrew names, West Asian names, and it's not representative of the entire history. And they only used a sex chromosome maternal study at the same time. So even if you had all of those other things, correct, you only use maternal lineages, which is mother, 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 mother. You're
Hmm.
not dealing with father, 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 father on the Y chromosome side, and you're not dealing autosomally with the full spectrum, the full breadth of the genome,
Right.
right? So there's also problems with Bayesian reconstruction and BEAST. There's discrepancies of just the available results that we can attain from that. Um, and again, mentioned sex bias sampling, small sample size, and the historical reasons. There's a white female Egyptologist. She's a white girl, Dr. Vanessa Davies, and she called this study the genetic version of William Flinders Petrie invading pharaonic race theory,
Wow.
right? And that is basically the core of Hermeticism. These white Caucasians came into Egypt and basically civilized all of Africa. This is a white woman. A
Right.
white woman called it that, right?
Right.
So like, and then another thing that they do, and I've heard many people, in this community do, is like they try to get these markers and they act as if these markers like M1 came from Eurasia.
Mm.
When these scholars, Dr. Gordine and Dr. Shamar Kikeda said that M1 is not indicative of Eurasian ancestry. M1 is an African marker. It was in Africa before it was in Eurasia. And even ones like R, how you have R marker that came into Africa, right?
Hmm.
Our marker came into Africa into the Lake Chad Basin during a back migration, and then it exploded across, the continent.
Hmm.
Most of the R markers, particularly RV 1589, found in ancient Kemet, they came from Chad.
Mm.
So the R, and even in modern Egypt today, these R markers are Chadian, so they're Central African. So people will try to use these different things to trick you
Hmm.
into thinking that these are Eurasians. But if you understand the origin and the distribution of these different haplotypes,
Hmm.
you'll understand that for the most part, when you're dealing with ancient Kemet, and this has been confirmed by Dr. Shamar Kikeda, his pop affiliator analysis, most of the genetic markers in ancient Kemet are infra-Saharan African or so-called sub-Saharan. He uses infra-Saharan because sub-Saharan is a racist term, right? But
Right.
you can see here, you can see the autosomal study. Most of the 18th dynasty is over 90% infra-Saharan African, so-called South-Saharan African, black African, over 90%.
Right, right, right,
So,
right. So, but all right, so I remember a few people saying that it wasn't the pop affiliator didn't have enough data in order to make
Dozy,
that
that's a
conclusion.
lie. It's a lie because if it didn't have enough data, they use 8 out of 13 STRs is good enough for the FBI to discern somebody's ethnicity.
Mm.
So if it's good enough for the FBI, it's good enough for basic research.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. How and so what was the data that they said what was missing?
Well, there are other STRs that you can come up with here,
Hmm.
basically to. And by the way, there's different haplogroup predictors. Not every haplogroup predictor is created equally.
Yeah.
Like right here, this is an example of haplotypes in Tanzania and the different haplogroup predictors that they use. You have with Athes predictor, you have the NevGen predictor and the common prediction in green. And with Athi is in yellow. And with Athi is much more closer to the common prediction than NevGen in the blue. And the reason why this is important is you could have, Ramasu. Ramasu, is a Nisu, a pharaoh who had E1B1A.
Hmm.
And with Athi predicts him at about a 98% probability of E1B1A. You put that into Nevgen in the blue, he'll be R, he'll be J, he'll be some West Asian white Arab, haplogroup.
Hmm.
And they use these things to try to trick you. So it could be the case that in a certain, calculator, this same data could render something different.
Hmm.
But like I said, not every haplogroup predictor is created equally. So a lot of people, when they see data like this, that contradicts their racist orientation and actually affirms the blackness of these ancient civilizations, they try to find ways out and they try to use a haplogroup predictor that will promote their propaganda. But according to this, and this is a peer-reviewed research, 8 out of 13 STRs, good enough for the FBI. It's good enough for these PhDs to present at an international symposium of Sheikh Anta Diop. It's facts. It's solid. We ain't got nothing to worry about.
Okay. Because I do remember when the back and forth, there was a lot of people involved with the pop affiliator analysis. And if you can, for the people that may have not saw the original, back and forth, and that may be, wanting to understand this a little bit better, can you explain what pop affiliator, a population affiliator analysis is?
Sure, sure. So pop affiliator analysis is basically a calculator that can predict your haplotype and predict your it can predict your ancestral affiliation based upon regions of your chromosomes called the short tandem repeats. And those are marked at the top. You see that CSF1PO, the D2S1338, et cetera, et cetera. So they're basically it's like an online calculator that calculates individual affiliation to major groups based upon these STR markers. And Dr. Shamarka Keita put these STR markers from Dr. Zawi Hawass, who is an anti-black racist.
Right.
Most people
Oh yeah.
certainly know that.
Hmm.
This is his data. So Dr. Shamarka Keita took his data from this anti-black racist in this calculator to see what these AT dynasty mummies were, and they came out as black African through and through.
Now, in academia, as we know, there's as we stated before, everything is political, right? Now,
Right.
has Dr. Keita gotten any pushback for his findings?
Well, this is where the nuance comes in because most modern Egyptologists will admit that the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Kemites, the Rim and Kemi, were Africans,
Hmm.
but they won't say that they're black. They'll say they're a different type of white
They're,
African,
yeah, 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 yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
so they'll because Shamarka Keita doesn't necessarily in his work directly use black. He doesn't really directly connect the ancient Kemites to
Hmm.
black.
Hmm.
However, he did write an article, which in my opinion is one of his greatest articles, in defense of Sheikh Anta Diop, called "The Mischaracterization of Sheikh Anta Diop's Ideas." And he excoriated a lot of people who lie on Diop and use things that he didn't say. And he basically articulated what Diop meant when he used the word neg or
Hmm.
black.
Hmm.
And what he was talking about was the full phenotypic diversity of the African continent,
Right,
the complete from light skin to dark skin, cool, woolly hair to wavy hair, big eyes to small eyes. He incorporated that into blackness.
right.
So that brings it into a scientific conversation as opposed to the BS social construct,
Of
retort
blackness.
that a lot
Yeah,
of people try to use.
yeah, 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 absolutely. Because, that's one of the things that I also see is, um, we can't call them black because the social construct of blackness did not exist then. And what I usually say to that though is, if that is the case, you shouldn't. Why are we calling ancient Greece and Rome white then? Right?
Yeah.
Like, why does it not work both ways?
Yeah, and the thing about it is there's a trend within modern Egyptology to affirm black people and to oppose the white supremacy that we know is like apparent in their field. from Steiner to James Henry Breasted to Grafton Elliott Smith and the whole 9 yards. And this Egyptologist, Angela Stein, actually affirmed that Takabuti, which there was a test on Takabuti, being reported as H4A and more European and African. She saw that analysis as part of a racist and conservative legacy. This is an Egyptologist, white female
Hmm.
Egyptologist in her field to make Kemi a white civilization.
Mm.
She said that they completely ignored the context of migrations and the presence of Eurasian immigrants in Northeast Africa during the late period, right? And in response to that, the head curator, Hannah Crowdy, of the Takabuti exhibition said that her ancestors may not have always lived in ancient Kemi. So if you're familiar with the pseudo killers and
Yeah.
brothers Garfield and Og, where they're trying to dispute Smash, and they bring in all these white Egyptologists to talk about Black history and Black civilizations, and damn near all of them said, "Yeah, ancient Kemet was black. We were
Right.
black people. They call themselves black."
Right.
So yes, you could see the growth, and they're moving more towards the African centered perspective.
Right. Indeed. Indeed. And so whenever we talk about archaeological findings, is there any evidence of any links between, West Africa and the cultural continuity or direct influence from ancient Egypt? Artifacts,
Plenty.
architectural styles, burial practices, because that's one of the things that as you know me, we've been talking online for a while. I have issues with the FBA people, and one of the
Yeah.
things that I do to to show and prove, that we are not like Native Americans, that we are African people, are these types of actually everything that you're using now, except but I think the archaeological findings sometimes hit a little bit different because it's something that the layperson can understand. Like if we're talking about like Native Americans, for instance, and different arrowheads that might have been found in Clovis culture, and then you see those same
Mm-hmm.
arrowheads in Siberia. Like
Yeah.
that's a lot of that that says something, right? And so when it comes to West Africa and ancient Kemet, is there anything similar?
There's plenty. There's plenty. So you have Dr. Peter Brunig's analysis, and he's looking at these type of arrowheads, as you mentioned, and he looks at specifically the bifacially retouched wing projectile points of Zillam in northeast Nigeria. And you can kind of see some of them here, up here
Hmm.
to the top
Hmm.
left. And what he found is that these projectile points, and I can see if it'll let me to zoom in. Can you see that right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, these projectile points are what he used to trace the Saharan migrate the Saharan populations who migrated south after the desiccation or the end of the African human period about 5,000 years ago. And the oldest version of this can be found near the Karga Oasis, in pre-dynastic Kemi, and that's the origin of these bifacially winged projectile points. And then he finds more modern versions of that in northeastern Nigeria. So it shows that those same populations in pre-dynastic Kemet migrated towards the Lake Chad Basin. And let me go on. And then this is another aspect. Peter Brunig was looking at the incised, highly burnished slipped sherds. There's specific types of pottery at Gajigana sites. And this connects ancient Kushites and modern West Africans because you first see these types of pottery in ancient Kush, right?
Mm.
Before see them in West Africa.
What
In the
makes what
Gajigana
makes this
sites.
pottery distinct from other pottery for people that may want to, be able to connect
Well,
with
it's
it?
really polished, and that those slipped sherds at the top that you see right there at the top
Yeah.
are
Hmm.
really distinct.
Hmm.
And like it's just like it has like a kind of like a laminate texture to it, and
Hmm.
that's what distinguishes it from other forms of pottery. Now, I think I skipped. There's like another pottery. Yeah, right here. Okay, so this is Dr. Kevin McDonald, and he's talking about the lighter bond complex, and this is another pottery, what they call horizons, that originated in the Happy River Basin, Happy for Nile River Basin, and then it gradually spread westward across the Wadi Hawar. The Wadi Hawar is what's also called the Yellow Nile, and it was a western branch. A lot of people don't know that there was a western branch of the Nile River that extended into West Africa. So our ancient African ancestors traveled along this western
Hmm.
branch to reach the Lake Chad Basin before they eventually extended into the Malian Sahara between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, right?
Wow.
Now you have the dotted wavy line pottery complex, and this is unveiling a bidirectional movement and a dynamic zone of interaction between the Happy River Valley and the Central Saharan zone. And then you have corded wrapped roulettes, and this is a huge one because corded wrapped roulettes are the type of pottery that most people use to try to connect the ancient Tichit culture to modern West African cultures. Now, the ancient Tichit culture is important because more than anything, the facts surrounding the ancient Tichit culture solidly affirm the affiliation and the link between modern West Africans and the pharaonic civilization. Not only because of orature, because if you look at the Soninke orature, they say that they descended into the region of the inner Nile River Delta, and they met the Kakoro population, right? And the Kakoro population were diminutive, foragers and
Hmm.
hunters, and some of them, inherited pastoralism from Saharan migrants. And they said that they fought against them and they defeated them. They
Wow.
defeated them, and then they basically incorporated them into their society. And according to the Soninke orature, the Kakoro or the Kakolo people, they were the creators of the ancient Tichit culture. And most West African populations, they have an oral narrative describing these diminutive populations, so-called Twa
Hmm.
people, that
Hmm.
they encountered in West Africa when they migrated over to the West African region. Now, a lot of people, they look at the corded roulettes of the ancient Tichit culture, and they find it in the inner Nile River Delta, mainly in sites like Tlemcen, the Tlemcen Valley in Mali, in Feta, and they use this to try to affirm that these West African populations had nothing to do with any external migration, and they're solely linked to that southern Mauritanian Haute Depression region that is now housed, or that housed the Tichit culture in the past. But if you look at the origin point of the corded wrapped roulettes, there's actually three hypotheses around the origin of this pottery, right? The
Hmm.
first one is that they were found in both the Central Sahara and the Nile,
Hmm.
because you find them in both places. And then they became less popular over time, but then made a strong comeback from the West African Sahara, so-called Tichit culture, in the third millennium BC.
Wow.
Second hypothesis is that between 11 to 8,000 years ago, these types of corded wrapped roulettes were only found in the southern Algeria and central Niger. That's the so-called Tassili culture. And then, but during the third millennia BC, they spread widely. And then the third is that in southeastern Mauritania, in the middle Niger Basin, cord wrapped roulettes were not seen before the third millennium BC. And then early examples were all derived from cord wrapped combs, stamps, or bracelets, not necessarily cylindrical cords. So
Mm.
all is that to say is that when we look at these cord wrapped roulettes, that this is the pottery that most distinctively defines West African pottery traditions, or it's a pottery that most scholars say this is indicative of migrations from the Sahara to the Sahel without any type of external interaction.
Hmm.
But if you look at what the scholars are saying, they see it in the Nile and the Central Sahara. So
Right.
they're not necessarily certain about the origin point of these corded wrapped roulettes, right? And it
Mhm.
could be indicative of interactions across that Sahelian zone.
Wow. Wow. Um, okay. Where did you have more to show as
Yeah,
far?
there's a lot more. I mean,
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I know.
I
I
can
know.
keep going. I can
Um,
keep going.
um, no, that's amazing. Yeah, show one more, man. I'm intrigued.
This is a major one. So this is Dr. Anne
Hmm.
Mayor,
Hmm.
and she reveals the origins of temper and concave anvil matted ceramics, and you can kind of see it right
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
You have an anvil, and you have a stone used to mat it onto an impression,
Mm,
right?
right. Right. Hmm.
And she found that this form of ceramic originated on the Sudano-Chadian border in Eastern Africa roughly 3,000 years ago, before spreading westward to the Chada and Jaliva River Basin, or the Niger and the Benue River Basin, evolving from the usage of stone pestles to clay pestles. So when she looks at concave matted ceramics, particularly those that are found in Western Africa, she says these forms of ceramics came to Western Africa from Northeast Africa via Niger. So
Hmm.
that would be clearly indicative of a population dispersal from the Happy River Basin and around it into Western Africa.
Right. Oh wow, man, that's that's deep. Where can if people want to, I guess do some research on their own, where should they start as far as these archaeological findings? Just kind of take this presentation and start looking up the journal articles from about them.
Yeah, I would say that the Oxford Handbook of African Archaeology is a really good one. That's where
Hmm.
I found the sources from Peter Brunig.
Hmm.
Also, Anne Mayor. She also has another article dealing with carnelian beads and the fact that she finds ancient Kemetic or late period Kemetic carnelian beads in Senegambia, which, according to Diop, actually shows the dispersal of the pharaonic civilization across the continent.
Hmm.
And she has an article called Ethnicity and Ceramics in the Niger River Bend. She's a really good source of information. And then I would say preliminarily, you could look at some of the work by Christopher Ehret and Kevin
Yeah.
McDonald in archaeology, or even, going back to the basics, because I named a bunch of European scholars, but check out Diop
Right.
in Civilization and Barbarism, African Origin of Civilization,
Right.
beautiful books. The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, Africa and the Need for a Federated State. Basically, anything by Diop, anything by Obenga is really, really brilliant. And I would encourage those who want an African centered perspective to start with them first before moving on to the more advanced work of some of their students.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so one of the things that could be used to connect West Africa and uh, ancient Kemet is the historical record, right? And so,
Yeah.
is there any ancient texts that exist that document migration or contact between Egypt and West African regions? And are those sources credible? And also, because I think this is important too, because in one of the they like to say that although we're an oral tradition in West Africa, they they like to act as if there was no form of any type of writing anywhere, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you can, yeah, what is there any historical record that could possibly corroborate the other evidence that we have?
Yeah, and I wish I had this part written down, but it's all good. Or first of all, oral narratives are definitely valid when it comes to Africana history. It
Absolutely.
is part of Eurocentric propaganda to say that they're invalid, and to even go back to linguistics, right?
Hmm.
Without without orature, there's no linguistic data. You
Mm.
have to speak the linguistic data in order to record it.
Hmm.
And most things that were historically recorded were oral first,
Right.
right? So oral is just as good of a form of analysis as anything else. But the issue is that Africana scholars, they take a scientific approach when it comes to discerning some of these oral narratives. They
Hmm.
look at the form, whether it's rhythmic prose, sung poetry, spoken word. They look at the background, whether it's a historical text, genealogy. They look at its historical content, whether it's historical traditions, historical songs, historical dramas, the depth of knowledge, like how much knowledge is actually discernible, its extension area, the geographic boundaries of these oral narratives, and then its origin and chronology. And without understanding this typology, it's nearly impossible to discern which facts are legitimate and which facts have changed, because
Hmm.
oral testimonies can certainly be dynamic, but Africana scholars, use a scientific approach to precisely locate the dynamism and see why certain narratives are changed. Sometimes it's geopolitical. Sometimes it's because, maybe the ruler accepted Islam and he wants to correlate his civilization to the Islamic empires.
Yeah.
But the difference is, and this is with West African history that a lot of
Hmm.
people don't understand,
Would that
is
be
that
similar like with Oduduwa being from Mecca or something, right?
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. And this is, and by the way, there is actually evidence, in the previous presentation, we located some migration waves from Dr. Nancy Bird,
Hmm.
who talk about Northeast Africans migrating into West Africa during the Arabic invasion period. So we
Hmm.
definitely do have evidence of that, even in the Yoruba population.
Wow.
But at the same time, there's different types of kinship in Africa. You have, genealogical or genetic kinship, biological kinship, spiritual kinship, political kinship, economic kinship. So it may be the case that those who are giving the oral renditions of Oduduwa descending from Mecca, they could be talking about a spiritual kinship. And
Yeah.
in that case, it would be correct.
Right.
Or let's say if certain Arabic traders traded in, valuables into West Africa and that enhanced the technology of the region, they could say, yeah, that's a technological kinship. But you
Mm.
have to be specific about what you're referring to
Hmm.
within each oral narrative.
Right, right. Wow. And so when it comes to, I think one thing that is always fascinating is just African cultural retentions, whether it be in the present or historically. Like, and so are there any cultural practices from religious rituals to social structures, to art in ancient Egypt that correlate with those in West Africa?
Yeah, I got to go back to the presentation. I'm going to share it again. You can see this.
Hmm.
So we go back to there's a scholar by the name of Chamberlain Ninkam from Western Cameroon, and he looked at colors and he found some of the same symbolism in ancient Kemet and modern Western Central
Mm.
Africa dealing with colors.
Hmm.
White, associated with purity, balance, innocence, sincerity in both civilizations, relating to Hedjet or the crown, the Hedjet crown in ancient Kimi. Then you got red, symbolizing themes of victory, life, and royalty, primarily the prototypes in the Deshret crown, right? And you see it among the Bambara, the Bamileke, and the Dogon, that red power symbolism. Then you got black. Obviously, black is super important, symbolizing both fertility and posthumous renaissance or renaissance of life after death. And you see that from ancient Kimi to the Bamileke. In blue, blue is huge from the Kepresh crown in ancient Kemet to West African cultures like the Dahomey and Bamileke. It symbolizes the creator and the triumph of life over death. And they even use some of the same plants, indigo tinctoria, indigofera tinctoria, for indigo production to make blue among the
Mm.
Bamileke in West Central Africa and ancient Kimi, right?
Wow,
So
wow.
this is a royal color that they use. Then you got green, green from the Osirian resurrection. Osar was called the Great Green or the Wajawur. And this symbolizes themes of rebirth and revitalization from ancient Kimi to societies like the Ngoyo people of Congo. And that's just colors,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
you can see from color symbolism, there's a lot of different correlations. Yellow, you got yellow from the Kenet expression, like the
Mm.
Happy Kenet would be the Wadi Hawar. And you
Mm.
see that among the Ngoyo of Congo, symbolizing gold, immortality, and eternity. So we can move on to these are just pastoral domesticates that you could use to trace the migrations. So most domesticates in Africa you see first in Northeast Africa before you see across the continent. Whether that's the taurine cattle or Bos primigenius formatoris, Equus formicabilis, or the horse. The horse is super prominent for the Soninke and the Ouagadougou Empire.
Hmm.
And the horse literally is one of the reasons that they conquered the Kakoro people, who
Mm.
they say built the Tiche culture. The
Wow,
horse came from Northeast Africa. The
wow.
horse came from around Kemet, right? So all of these domesticates, and there's plenty of them. The dog, Canis
Hmm.
lupus, form of familiaris, dogs on the African continent originated from the Northeast African dog,
Mm.
right? The donkey, the cat, the
Mm.
cat's in here somewhere. The Felis catus. There's a lot of cat lovers out there. The
Right.
cat has the genetics of the ancient Kemetic cat. Without this cat from ancient Kimi, not only in Africa but all over the world, they wouldn't have the specific haplotype, that signifies the modern Felis catus domestic cat.
Wow.
So that's just with animals,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
Animals in
Uh-huh.
color. You already see it.
Right.
And you can go down the list with, I got too many animals on this. I got birds, reptiles,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. What
You
about
be here forever.
any religious rituals?
Move on to going forward. Okay, so right there, leopard skin, Pantera
Mm.
pardus, right? You see that across
Mm.
the African continent. You get the
Absolutely.
Sem priest, and from the Sem priest to the Ekpe of Nigeria and
Mm.
Cameroon.
Right,
Super
right,
royal, symbol emblematic of strength and authority, right, across the continent.
right.
And
We even see the secret societies, the leopard societies in
oh
the
yeah,
diaspora, which is
oh yeah,
amazing to think about that that could possibly be the origin of that. Kemet.
Yeah, and there's
Yeah.
actually a. I'm going to go down. Oh, this is dealing with the elephant. The elephant. This is a sacred ritual
Hmm.
among the Bamileke of Western Cameroon to have an elephant mask, Loxodonta africana, and this was first domesticated by the Kushites in Meroe around 2,000 years ago, and it has the same association of potency and power among the Bamileke when you use this in weddings and funerals. Like my grandparents had this at their funeral,
Hmm.
birthday parties. You see that in classical Africa dealing with
Wow.
the elephant.
Wow.
There's a libation one that's a little bit further down that I want to get to. This is dealing with plants and fruits and stuff. Hairstyles. Yeah, hairstyles. Let me go. Oh, here we go. This one,
Hmm.
the Ogungun masked dancers, right? The
Hmm.
Ogungun masked dancers are emblematic of the Kemetic raising of the Jed pillar ceremony,
Wow.
according to Professor John C.V. Gomez.
Hmm.
And the Ogungun in Yoruba means bone or skeleton, echoing the Jed pillar significance as Asar's backbone in ancient
Mm.
Kimi. So
Wow.
you have West Africans retaining this symbolism from the Happy River Valley in the Agungun ritual of West
Wow.
Africa among the Yoruba and the Benin people population.
Now, when we start to think about this cultural continuity in the in certain West African cultures, are they aware that some of the things that they do possibly came from Kemet?
Oh
Meaning, like,
yeah.
it's part of their tradition that to say, just like how we were talking about Oduduwa and Mecca, is it? I mean, are there instances of that in certain West African cultures saying, "Hey, you know, this is from Kemet, our people or our ancestors in Kemet." Is
Mm-hmm.
there any is there any folklore? Not saying that it's not true, but just that's in the culture. Well, in any of these cultures that would let everybody know that, hey, these West African cultures are aware of this cultural
Yeah,
continuity.
plenty, plenty.
Mhm.
So Dr. Kamani Nousi, he actually wrote an article about this in a journal for the University of Manchester in the UK, and he was doing an analysis of the libation motifs, right? And he found that libation motifs, the prototype of it is ancient Kemet in the Happy River Basin.
Mm,
And most of the rituals, the orature, and the culture around these libation motifs are related and even explicitly detail, the ancestry, the sojourn from the classical civilizations of ancient Kimi into Western Africa. So
mm,
that's one. Then you have this is another one when you're dealing with the Coptic tunic and the Coptic tunic being related to some of the sacred Agbada tunics worn by West Africans like the Hausa and the Yoruba. And scholars such as Dr. Susan Preston Blyer and Theophilo Benga have found that they are correlated and deeply rooted within the same tradition. And obviously, the Yoruba, they have traditions of descending from ancient Kimi, even the Coptic culture by some of the Yoruba elites, and the Hausa as well. Sandro Capochichi, this is a big one. He shows that the cowrie decorated ram agides of West Africa originated with prototypes in the Happy River Basin. And this is dealing with the ram or Capris agagris forma hercus or Avis omen forma aries. And these are ram and sheep domesticates that originated in Northeast Africa before traveling to West Africa. And there's certainly orature, detailing that sojourn, especially the Awujali of Ujebuland of the Yoruba speaks about his ancestors descending from ancient Kush. And even if you look at the cowrie species, Monetaria moneta and Monetaria analis on these particular agites, they originated in East Africa before going into Western Africa.
wow.
Now, there's another one that I wanted to mention. This by Dr. Mini Yao Fabrice Elaine Davy, and he's speaking about the sandal symbolism in both the Akan of Ghana and ancient Kemet, as well as the throne symbolism of the
Hmm.
Akan of Ghana and ancient Kemet. And the Akan dealing with the orature of Nana Asaman and the Urere traditions of the Wagadu Empire they firmly assert that their ancestors originated in Aswan before migrating into Western Africa. And the term Soninke actually means Sonanke or people of Aswan, right?
Mm,
So numerous scholars among the Soninke have detailed that and spoken about that. So to answer your question in simple terms, absolutely yes. There's plenty of evidence to show, them detailing their cultural and even judicial heritage. If we're speaking about the Mande population coming from the pharaonic civilization.
And that's powerful. And I'm glad I'm glad you brought that out because um uh, obviously it's important that we tell our own stories and begin to research things from our own perspective. And I think this is an example of where and what you're doing is a great example of highlighting that, man. So for one, I definitely appreciate the work that you're putting in. This this presentation is amazing. But one thing that I noticed especially whenever we're dealing with um, what's going on in the YouTube world, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that they like to mention is geographical barriers and
Yeah.
the idea that certain cataracts prevented, people from the South going into Kemet. And so what are your thoughts about what that and I guess any type of geographical barriers between ancient Egypt and West Africa? Because I mean they say the same thing about that as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring up this article. There's
Mm,
an article that speaks about that idea that you just
mm,
mentioned and the
mm,
fact that there definitely was populations that traversed, from ancient Kemet into Western Central Africa and back.
mm.
And the article that I'm trying to find is one by Thomas Schneider called "The West Beyond the West," and I think I have it here. Let me share this real quick. I go here. Can you see this?
Yes, yes.
So this is a scholar. This is published in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections, and it deals with the fact that the Amduat of ancient Kemet, when it refers to awareness, is actually referring to the Lake Chad Basin.
Mm,
And there's actually inscriptions from Mentuhotep II located in the Lake Chad Basin along the Abu Balas Trail, right there, in that region right there. So this is indicating that there is a relationship and a travel between the ancient Egyptians and the Lake Chad Basin populations. So just off of this alone, you can see that the Sahara is definitely not a barrier because you
mhm,
even have lexical items and some diffusions of terms, in these Chadic languages, using the Medu Neter, and even this area right here. Because if you look at the Lake Chad Basin was a lot larger in ancient times than it is now, way bigger, right?
mhm,
So in its maximum extent right here, it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult to travel, from ancient Kimi into the Lake Chad area right there. And many scholars have even articulated this. There's another scholar that I can show you, and he's dealing with the amount of pre-colonial African trade,
mhm.
and he's from Oxford University is where he published it. And his article alone basically debunks that notion,
Right.
completely debunks that notion. And let me see if I could find this pre-colonial. A lot of this stuff is in my drive, um, and it takes a long time for me to find it if I haven't organized it.
Yeah, no problem, no problem.
Yeah. So I think I have it here. Is this it? Okay, perfect. Now if I go back here, boom, and you can see this right there. So
Yes.
this is a scholar from Zimbabwe called Dr. Chadwick Chirakuri, and he's documenting the pre-colonial trade that existed on the African continent.
Hmm.
And in this article right here, he even lists the different metallurgical items that were traded. And as you can see it, extending across here in ancient Kemet, going into West Africa, Central Africa, and all these items were traded along, trading ports in
Mm.
migration pathways.
Hmm.
And according to his scholarship, this existed from 10,000 years ago. From
Wow.
10,000 years ago and onward, communities in the
Wow.
Sahara and the Nile were involved in trade and exchange. And by 5,000 BCE, they had acquired domestic animals from Asia,
Wow.
right? And
Hmm.
these domestic animals were incorporated into an African mode of production. So again, this study,
Right.
this is in Oxford, super prestigious. Y'all can research this, if you want, but like this proves that the idea that the Sahara was a barrier is BS. And even if I were to look at, and I think that may be getting into the next point, but even if I were to look at, I say trans-Saharan trade
Hmm.
right here, like right here, you can see these trading ports. So you
Mm.
can see these ports that were established, in antiquity to trade between these different civilizations, right? So
Yeah, well, let's
bottom
get
line
into
is,
that some more then. I mean, what is the evidence that there is trade routes between ancient Egypt and West Africa?
well, you're gonna find some carnelian beads, and I'm gonna go back to my previous. I'm going back and forth, but teamwork makes the dream work.
No doubt. No.
So if I go to this, no, this is not the one I wanted to share. Where's the other one? Is this one right there? I think this might be it. No, is that the same one, or is this a different one?
It's not sharing yet.
Oh, it's not sharing anything. Oh, can you
Yeah, there,
see?
yeah, I can see it now. All right, well, I
Wait,
see
this
your
this is
screen.
this is the one. Wait, let me.
Yeah.
I gotta figure out. I gotta figure out which window. I got like multiple windows
No,
open.
you good.
Yeah, let me go to boom, 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 boom. Show. All right, so I think this is the one. This one right here. Share. So we have a lot of items that were traded. We go down. First of all, the pastoral domesticates alone, these animals, they prove it, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And this is research from Dr. Viral Linciel on pastoralism in Africa. Right. So the animals, right off the bat, Sus corva domestica, the pig, domestic sheep, Ovis amen forma aries, the chicken, Gallus forma domestica. All y'all who love fufu with chicken, the goosey with chicken, them chickens came from Northeast Africa. That cat, these birds, we could go on. We could go on. We could even move on to the because I got hella animals. I got hella animals. Move on to the plants. Watermelon, Citrullus lanitus.
Wow.
The watermelon seeds in King Tut's tomb came from West Africa. That's
Wow.
been proven.
How do they prove that?
Genetics. They looked
Mm,
at the West African watermelon and they compared it with other watermelons across the continent. And they
wow.
found that King Tut's watermelon was from West Africa.
Wow.
Then you have then you have black eyed peas. The black
Wow.
eyed peas in the fifth dynasty. They came from West Africa. So they was eating black eyed peas from West Africa in the old kingdom. And you look at them Cajun seeds. Cajun is Cajun or pigeon peas in the 12th dynasty. They were also from West Africa,
Wow.
right?
Hmm.
And this is from the research by Roger Blinch. Castor bean originated in East Africa, then spread to West Africa. So this is an example of trade in the other direction. Then you have Moringa oleifera, again from east to west Africa. So West African moringa most likely came from Northeast Africa. Then you have Abris precatorius, or that rosary pea, again traded from east to West Africa. And this was found in Thebes in
Mm,
ancient Kemet. So
hmm.
these West Africans who got that rosary pea, it was related to that found in Thebes in ancient Kemi around 7,000 BCE. Then you got that okra. Okra is from Eastern Africa. Not a lot of people know that. So y'all like eating okra fufu with a goosey. Abelmoscus esculentis originated in Abyssinia and is now found throughout, the African continent,
Wow.
right? So that proves it right there. Then you got for those of y'all who love music, I know you like music,
Absolutely.
Rakeem. When you look at the arch harp originated, according to Dr. Gerard Kubrick. He's a musicologist, one of the most famous musicologists on earth. This originated in the old kingdom of ancient Kemet, then spread across the continent, and it evolved. It evolved to the spoon and cup design, or the ananga in Uganda, and then the Tankundi harp of the Azande in Congo, and even the shelved Kele harp in Gabon.
Wow.
So all of these arched harps, throughout Africa, they developed turning pegs and resonators. All of these harps, these intricate harps, they're based upon a prototype in the old kingdom of ancient Kemet. So for
Hmm.
music, you have an intricate connection. You can look at the hairstyles. We can get into the oboe's bonnet and the Hogan bonnet related to the Nemez headdress, and you see that among the Oba, of the Yoruba people. You
Hmm.
got the Fulani hairstyles that have prototypes in Kemetic hairstyles. Even some of the naming conventions of the hairstyles are related in the Fulani and the Metrem and Kimi language. That Amasunzu hairstyle, rooted in that Kapresh headdress, but some scholars think the Kapresh wasn't even a crown, that it was related to a hairstyle,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
And the crown may have been made to fit the
Fit.
hairstyle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Look at that Uraeus, that Uraeus crown. You see that in the Oba of Benin and Amenhotep III,
Hmm.
right? And there's even moving on to this. This is the more important analysis. This is spatial temporal evolution. So not only do you have trade between regions, but you see prototypes in the Happy River Basin becoming developed and evolved as the
Mm.
civilizations advance in
Wow.
Western Central Africa. That
Wow.
Mer farming tool, you have a plant fiber braced timber prototype right there. Then it developed into a rivet fastened metallic tool. For all my engineers out there, y'all know what a rivet is. They actually developed that as they migrated from the Happy River Basin into infra-Saharan Africa. Then you got that mace, that hedge mace,
Yeah.
that Kemetic piriform mace. It evolved into this spike form in Congo, and it was more
Mm.
decorative, featuring these conical iron nails. So again, as you can see, West Africans, Central Africans, now they're taken from their Kemetic ancestors and they're building upon it and they're evolving as time goes by. The wicker baskets, they're originally found in woven wicker, and then they develop into grip-handled timber, baskets in Senegambia. And there was influence that evolution was influenced by environmental conditions and resources. A lot of times they didn't have the particular wickers that they needed to make the basket. So they're like, why not make it in timber? Why not make it solid? So they were intelligent as they were developing these forms. You got that harpoon. Everybody who likes to fish, y'all know about the harpoon. And you can see that it developed into a nylon coinoidal tool in Senegambia.
Wow.
This is all from the researcher Dr. Musa Lamb. You got these lost wax casting traditions of these intricate metallurgical items. And they developed from Happy River Valley prototypes into innovations seen from Ghana to Cameroon, where they had crucible attachments that were used to control gas and metallurgical flow. That Kopesh, y'all who like sword fighting, you see the Kopesh developing into, a non-cutting back edge with semicircular concavity in Congo. They made that thing way more deadlier
Mm.
and way more lively. And the Heka scepter, the Heka is a famous scepter in ancient Kemet. And you see West Africans in Mali, like the Dogon, developing it with an inflected hook and a midpoint disc handle, and even a cabeline or a horse headdress on the top of it.
Wow.
Then that wasp scepter developed among the Fulani into a uniquely fabricated, freshly trimmed beam placed in fire to augment its elasticity. So I could go on
Wow.
forever with these
Wow.
connections. There's too many of them to list, to be
No,
honest.
no, that's great. One thing, for uh as far as time frame, right? How do we consider the rise of ancient Egypt or Egyptian civilization occurring thousands of years before, you know, the significant state formation in West Africa? How do proponents of this theory reconcile the significant time gaps? Or are there any time gaps? Is that
Well,
a
the point about the time gaps is you have to know about the different states, proto states, and incipient states that existed in West and
right,
Central Africa prior
right.
to the modern emanations.
Hmm.
And that's where the research by Dr. Nancy Bird, and I'm going to go back to that slide right here. That research is super important because it literally shows you the genetic proof that we have. Let me exit out of this. Uh, Wait, where am I? Okay, here. Can you see this?
Yeah. Hmm.
All right, perfect, perfect. So we go down to Nancy Bertatow, her research, super important. I'll get to that slide if I could find it. Oh, I didn't even go into the sicknesses. That's another
Oh
aspect
yeah, yeah,
if you
yeah,
want me to
yeah.
get into that. So, like Dr. Jean-Philippe Gourdin, his analysis of tuberculosis in the Middle Kingdom of ancient Kemet revealed the presence of a West African L5 and L6 strain.
Mm.
So the tuberculosis in ancient Kemet in the Middle Kingdom is related to modern West African tuberculosis.
Wow, wow,
That's insane,
wow.
right? And you got the slide before, schistosomes by Dietmar Sturdiving. His analysis of human pathogens called schistosomes reveals a migration from the Great Lakes region, right, where they said that their ancestors came from the Tonnetters, right, or the foothills of the Mountains of the Moon, to the Happy River Delta, then subsequently into West Central and Southern Africa for schistosomes. Then you see leprosy during the late period where they tried to do the Abasir study. You see leprosy strains in the late period belonging to the 3L genotype that is found in modern West Africa and Brazil, and it clusters close to the S15 genotype found in Martinique, right? You got sickle cell, obviously. Sickle cell from Kemet came from Benin. Then you got, the elephantiasis, or severe lime swelling, has been observed in ancient Kemi and the Knox civilization. And we have archaeological evidence that suggests population movements across the Wadi Huar to the Lake Chad Basin.
Wow.
So that's that. And I'm going to go past all this other genetic data. Let me get down to Nancy Bird. Where's she at? She's somewhere here. Did I pass her? I might have passed her. Like, sometimes I go Nancy. Where's she at? Wait. I go Nancy. Oh, yeah, this one. So this one right here basically is going to show that the Lake Chad Basin, or the Kanem Empire, served as an intermediary point between ancient Kemet and Western Central Africa. So when you're looking at the development of Kanem, you're dealing with the immediate aftermath of the fall of ancient Kemi, and that's going to be the first few centuries of the contemporary period. And they developed at Kanem what's called the Wangara Inter-Empire. And this is like when you're looking at African state typology, first of all, African states develop in a different way from European states. We have a different mode, like we have what's called a double kingdom. And that was first defined by Jeremy Pope in his analysis of the 25th dynasty and the rulership of those so-called Nubian kings over ancient Kemi. They ruled both lands, right?
Right.
So you see that continuing in Western Central Africa in what's called the Wangara Inter-Empire. And if you give me some time, I could find the specific chart. I don't have it in this slide.
Yeah, that's fine. You can just talk. Yeah.
So basically what it is like it's showing affiliation of Western Central Africans to ancient Kemet by a trans-Sahelian empire that existed from the 7th to the 11th century, right? And that was from Senegambia over to the Happy River Basin. So if you look at some of these proto-states like Ngalam, which was the western part of the Sahara, Zagara, which is around the Lake Chad Basin, and Tajika along the Happy River Basin, these would be the predecessors to many of the subsequent states that developed, in Western Central Africa. And that would be the missing link between these modern African civilizations and the ancient pharaonic civilization.
Wow. All right. And that's deep, man. And so when it comes to different scholars such as yourself who support this idea of a link between West Africa and ancient Kemet, what are your thoughts on the alternative theories that suggest local evolution and development of West African civilizations independent of an ancient Egyptian influence?
They're bunk. They're trash. They're garbage. Because basically the flip side of diffusionism or historical culture archaeology, in that they argue for isolationism using what's called the Garden of Eden principle. And the Garden of Eden principle has been debunked and refuted in archaeology. And it basically states that areas are imbued with enough resources and enough, intellectual know-how to be able to develop independently without external inputs. Wow. And most archaeologists consider that fraudulent because some of the earliest human civilizations are mobile.
Right,
so
right.
If you don't have something, you're going to move. Even in the Tichik culture, and the Tichik culture is what a lot of these isolationists and certain West African tribalists try to use to separate West Africa and East Africa. But when you look at the structure of some of the monuments of the Tichik culture, you see a relationship with ancient Kerma in Eastern Africa. Dr. Salim Faraji, even when he did an analysis of the tumuli, of the El Ouedji or the El Ouedji tumuli in Mali, he found prototypes among the Nubian culture and the Kerman culture. And the orature of these West African civilizations do not state that they were always in West Africa. They say that they encountered a diminutive population that they subsumed into their culture. Many times it was a very violent interaction. And the genetic evidence that we have at our disposal even shows this. I think I passed it. It shows that modern West Africans do not primarily descend from ancient West Africans. If we were to look at some of the genetic data right here, this Shumlaka study, you see modern West Africans in this green branch right here, and they're more closer to Moda man in
Hmm.
Ethiopia 4,500 years ago than these ancient West African populations up here represented by the one. So the genetic evidence that we have at our disposal of the autosomal data basically corroborates with the oral testimonies.
Wow.
And archaeologically, it doesn't line up because of the fact that, you know, in Africana studies, you can't necessarily use archaeology to discount oral narratives. There's a scholar by the name of Dr. Taharka Ade who spoke about this. And what scholars do is that they try to corroborate archaeology with oral testimonies.
Hmm.
So if there's something that the archaeology gets different, you have to find why that is. If the oral testimony is different than the material record, you have to discern why that is, and you have to corroborate both together. But when you're looking at the West African archaeology, whether it's the concave matted ceramic traditions that we discussed before, whether
Hmm.
it's the axe from
Hmm.
Frederick Jesse, which originated with in the area of Darfur. They're called the Darfurian axes, and you find them in the Tlemcen Valley of Mali. The pastoral domesticates blow it out of the water because all of the pastoral cultures in West Africa originated in Northeast Africa. And even the architecture. Like there's a scholar by the name of Dr. Namdi Ella, and he even, when he looks at the elements of architecture, he finds prototypes in the Old Kingdom of
Wow.
ancient kingdom.
Wow.
So it's looking at vaulted roofs, it's looking at the projecting sills, the external stairs, the courtyard or the impluvium, the molded framed openings, all of these elements of architecture that are found across the continent and specifically in West Africa have prototypes in the Happy River Valley. So in every field of knowledge, the isolationist view can easily be refuted. You know, it's just that some people deal with tribalism, other
Yeah.
people are opposed to Pan-Africanism, so they would, you know, they wouldn't accept it. But any of us who objectively looks at the evidence knows that we are deeply, intricately related to that cultural cradle in the Happy River Valley.
Wow. Um, Brother Kamji, this has been obviously a extremely dope presentation, man. It's a lot of information in here that people can go and research for themselves. A lot of different um, scholars and books and journals that have been mentioned. So, I mean, it's extremely thorough, man. And again, I appreciate you for coming through Wazadon TV and sharing that with us, man. It's yeah, I'm kind of at a loss for words, man, because it's extremely thorough, man. And I'm definitely gonna have to watch it a couple times myself, you know.
Yeah, I appreciate you for having me. Like my only regret is like sometimes I don't have my elements as organized,
Hmm.
you know, but also like this is a lot of information and it takes me
Yeah,
a lot of time to put this together.
right.
And I'm glad that you appreciated the presentation. And I look forward to any future conversations that we want to have, you know,
Absolutely.
chop it up.
This is definitely the first of many, man. And everybody make sure y'all go subscribe to Kamjiverse on YouTube. The link is in the description. As you can see, he's a powerful scholar. So again, thank you for your time and also thank you for the work that you're putting in, brother.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
No doubt, man. You have a great evening.
You too.
All right, peace.
Peace.